Hi, I'm Larry Scogan, the interim chancellor of the North Dakota University System, and delighted to be here on the campus of Bismarck State College in our continuing series of conversations at BSC. Normally, for those of you that watch this program, you know that my good friend Clay Jenkinson, who's the humanities scholar for Bismarck State College, is sitting up here on this stage with me, and so it's a little bit different for me to be a solo guy up here on the stage. I'm a little nervous about how this is all going to work out, but with the technology that we have today, Clay is today in Rome, Italy, where he is teaching for the University of Mary at the request of Monsignor Jim Shea. And so with that, would you please welcome to our stage virtually Clay Jenkinson.
I'm so glad to be here, Larry. How many people are in the audience there in Bismarck?
I would say about 700. Okay, it's not quite that many, but it is an admirable audience. There's got to be 100 folks in here. It's a beautiful day here in North Dakota, and I'm just delighted that so many folks have come out. Really, it's a centennial conversation that we're having here on World War I, which at that time was called the Great War. And under Woodrow Wilson's thought process, it was the war to end all wars. And of course, we know that that failed miserably. But we're going to talk about that today, Clay. And because we're separated by, I think you calculated 5,100 miles, we're going to see how this works as a conversation. But please, at any time, I can see you constantly, and you can see me constantly. And so if there's something you want to interject, please just give me a high sign, and we will carry on with the conversation. I'm excited to see how this all works. So,
well, Larry, let me just say,
yes.
Start. What an amazing thing this technology is. I mean, I'm in a building in Rome. It's 10:15 p.m. here. You're in a building in Bismarck, North Dakota. It's 3:15 there. We're talking as if we are really next door to each other. The resolution is extraordinary. I remember when 2001: A Space Odyssey came out in 1968, and they had that video call between the astronaut and his daughter, who had her birthday back on Earth, and I thought, that'll never happen. And if it does happen, only the super rich will be able to afford such a thing. But here we are. This is actually free. So I am speaking to you from halfway around the world for 2 hours, theoretically, free. It's an unbelievable sign of the genius of modern technology. And I, in some sense, I'm old enough to hardly be able to believe that this is possible, but I see you right there in a polka dot tie. So go ahead, start the PowerPoint.
As an administrator former administrator of this college, and I'm sure on behalf of Monsignor Shea at the University of Mary, I do want to say, Clay, that it ain't free. The technology.
Well, Dusty gets everything he wants, I know.
That's right. Okay. So at any rate, okay. So now let's begin talking about World War I, the Great War, and I'm going to advance the first slide. I'm going to have to tell Clay when we advance here. So this is the war to end all wars. So just bullet what we're going to talk about. Amazingly, it is December 7th today, after all. And as I was reminded today, it's Sunday, December 7th, which of course is the date that World War II started. And how many of you in this room right now can remember where you were December 7th, 1941? Look at that, quite a few hands. So I can't, I know Clay can't, but it's
I wasn't even conceived. I wasn't even imagined.
Yeah, and but at any rate, so I am going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to have a little conversation about that. But the questions we want to deal with today is: how did it start? Why did it start? The war itself. Although I will say that I'm not technically a military historian, we're not going to get into a lot of battles because the battles get very complex, and there were very, very large battles, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then how the United States got involved in the war, and then and Clay's going to kind of take over at this point where we're talking about North Dakota. and North Dakota's involvement in World War I as well. And then because Clay is in Italy, he's going to talk a little bit about the Italians in World War I. I will say, relative to World War I, the only site I've ever seen are the trenches that still exist up on the frontier between Austria and Italy. And I visited those when I was living in Italy, and so actually got to walk through some of the bunkers that they had built up there in the mountains. And so we'll talk a little bit about the Italians and then war's end, and we will end with that. So to begin with, I want to make the argument, and Clay, I would certainly be interested in any of your thoughts about this. When I was growing up, we talked a lot about the Second World War because that was the war of our parents. And that was the war of a number of the folks that are sitting in here right now. And there was not a strong connection to a discussion about World War I. And so going through school, we said, well, there was World War I, and we really didn't get involved in that. And then World War II, and that was the big one. And later on, Tom Brokaw told us that that was the greatest generation, and I believe that fought that war and won that war. But our focus was always on World War II. When I started teaching history at the Air Force Academy, I began seeing more and more the connections between World War I and World War II. And I often told the cadets, and I still believe this today, that historians, as we move further and further away from the 20th century, historians are going to see a continuity, and it's going to be as if it's one war. It's not going to be World War I, World War II, except when they're talking specifically about the war, but it's going to be probably the war of the 20th century. And they're going to tie them together. You know, in English history, there's the 100 Years' War, but if you break it down, it's a number of shorter wars, but it lasted for 100 years between England and France. And I think we're going to be able to see this very clearly, the further distance that we get from World War II. And the further distance that we get from the 20th century. But just want to show you, during World War I, the gentleman on, it would be your far left, a sort of portly gentleman there, who of course is Winston Churchill. He was actually First Lord of the Admiralty for Great Britain during World War I. He ended up getting fired from that job, and then he volunteered for service and ended up fighting in the trenches for the English as well. So that was his involvement in World War I. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sitting in the middle there, was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he ended up taking that job, and I'm sure he was very happy because, Clay, is that not the same position that Theodore Roosevelt held during the Spanish-American War as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy? And
Roosevelt, Theodore was the hero of Franklin Roosevelt, and he patterned his political rise and his political career after that of his fifth cousin. And so because TR had been governor of New York, FDR wanted to be governor of New York because TR had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That was the role that Franklin took, and then of course he got what TR desperately wanted. TR said only the great ones are the ones that have lived through a gigantic world crisis, and you have to have presided over some almost cataclysmic event to be considered great, and he, TR, didn't get that during his 7 years and 171 days, and his fifth cousin got not only one, but two enormous crises and saved the world.
Okay. Then the third gentleman, Joseph Stalin, was a Bolshevik revolutionary, and we'll talk a little bit about that because that occurs during World War I, and in fact is the whole reason that Russians will end up pulling out of the war. And then the man pointing his finger, Adolf Hitler over there, was of course a German corporal who had incredible experiences in World War I, fought in the trenches, was gassed himself. One of the phenomenons that I have always been interested in about World War II is that as desperate as the Germans got in World War II, they did not resort to gas, and which there was plenty of. Now, they used gas to get rid of the Jews and to get rid of communists and to get rid of other folks they disagreed with, but they didn't use gas on the battlefield, and I'm convinced, this is just Larry Scogan talking, that Adolf Hitler's experience with gas during World War I is the reason the Germans never resorted to gas in World War II. So then moving to World War II, when we get to World War II, Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister of England, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the President, Joseph Stalin becomes the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and of course de Fuhrer in Adolf Hitler. It is impossible, from my perspective, to talk about World War II then without understanding World War I. And I don't think that we spent enough time in our educational experiences studying World War I to understand it and how that got us to World War II. So, and we can converse about that more as we get to the end of this, Clay, if we want to have more conversation about that. So let's just start off with, how did it start? How did World War I start? Well, it's very simple. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was heir of the Habsburg throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie, were assassinated on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo. And they were, the people in Sarajevo were Slavic, most of them Serbians, and they were part of the empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I'm going to show you some maps here in a little bit. So if somebody wanted to say, well, how did the war start? It started because a guy named Princip assassinated the Archduke. And here's what Europe looked like on the verge of World War I. You see the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe. Ottoman Empire was disintegrating at that time. But you can see by the color scheme what ends up as the Allies in the green and the Central Powers and sort of the brown. That's what Europe looked like. Now I want you to focus your attention. You can see Serbia down there on south of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this assassination occurs in Sarajevo, where people are Serbians, by a Serbian assassin. This area is called the Balkans, and there were many conflicts in that area at the time. In fact, in 1905, there was another war that was fought down in this area. And this whole area had been an area of great upheaval, really going back into the late 1890s, 1880s. And then in the early 1900s, again, there had been some wars fought there. So this is the Balkans. And that's Serbia. The Kingdom of Serbia was part of the Balkans, and it was part of that controversial area that was, and I'm not going to go into all of those details, but part of that controversial area. Now here's the next arrow I want you to watch carefully. That's where Sarajevo is. Sarajevo is not in Serbia. Sarajevo had Serbians, but Sarajevo itself is not within the Kingdom of Serbia. But the reason that becomes so important for our discussion today is because of this man. This is Princip and his co-conspirators that are put on trial. Princip is a Serbian, and Princip, well, first they're Slavics, then they're Serbians, and Princip is the man that actually fired the 2 shots that killed the Archduke and his wife. Here they are in an Austro-Hungarian court where they are sentenced, but because of his age, and you would think the guy has assassinated the heir apparent to the throne of this empire, he ends up getting some jail time and ends up dying in jail in 1918, so he didn't even serve much of his jail sentence. This is why this is important, and Clay, jump in at any time. So the Serbians are Slavic, and so are the Russians. So the Serbians have contacted the Russians on this controversy that's broiling and have asked the Russians, will you support us? And the Russians give them assurances that they will. In the meantime, the Austro-Hungarians have contacted the German Empire and said, as this thing is bubbling up, and understand there's a long history between these countries as well, and the Austro-Hungarians asked the Germans if the Germans will support them in this growing controversy that's happening, and they say they will. So here's the rush to war, keeping in mind that map. So on June 28th, there's the assassination. On July 5th, Kaiser Wilhelm of the German Empire urges Austria to take action against Serbia, Because the thought is that the assassination is actually tied to a secret conspiracy within Serbia to break off that part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and make it part of Serbia. So on July 5th, the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, tells the Austrians to take speedy action against Serbia. The next day, the German Chancellor informs the Austrians, and this is a quote, "Whatever Austria's decision, she should count with certainty upon it, that Germany will stand behind her as an ally." This is called in history the blank check. So the Austrians are told by the Germans, whatever you're going to do, we will support you. So that's the blank check from the Austrians. So on the 23rd, Austria issues a 48-hour ultimatum to Serbia, so onerous it's impossible for Serbia to accept. And here was just one example. The Austrians tell the Serbians, our police from Austria, you will allow our police to come into Serbia to investigate this conspiracy to the end. We will have full police power in your country. It would be like, I don't know, Canada saying to the United States, we don't like what's going on here, so we're going to send our police force into the United States, and you're going to accept that. Well, the United States would say, of course not. We're not going to accept that. That violates our sovereignty as a nation. And so it was very clear that the Austrians were pushing for war against Serbia in the demands that they issued against the Serbians. So on July 25th, Serbia mobilizes. On the 26th, Austria mobilizes. On the 28th, Austria declares war on Serbia. And also on the 28th, then, Russia starts partial mobilization. Because remember, the Serbians went to the Russians and said, will you support us in this conflict, this growing conflict? And the Russians have said yes. So now, when Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia starts partial mobilization. So this is now what our map is looking like. Austria-Hungary has declared war on Serbia, and the Russian Empire is mobilizing. The problem is that the Russian Empire is so big, and the mobilization is going to go so slowly that when the Russian bear starts waking up here, if you will, and starts waking up and mobilizing, the Russian bear is mobilizing against both Austria and Germany along its whole western border. Clay, anything yet?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of quick things, Larry. I like your idea that World War II is a continuation of World War I. You know, that the war began in 1914 because there was great instability in Europe, and you have two crumbling empires. The Ottoman Empire is falling apart. It's an Islamic empire controlled in Turkey, and it's beginning to break up, and it will soon be gone. After the war, there is no more Ottoman Empire. Austria-Hungary is also a very unstable coalition. It includes these Slavic states in what's now Yugoslavia and Albania, but these are Slavs. They're not Teutons. They're not Germans. And the Serbians are pushing, they're on the rise, and they're pushing to not only break out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but to include Sarajevo and much more of what would become Yugoslavia. Meanwhile, Germany is just becoming a nation. It has just really become a nation, and it's on the rise. And so you have all this instability, and so if it hadn't been the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, it would have been something else probably. This was a war that was waiting to happen, and the assassination touched it off. But the way, as you've just described, how all these countries sort of rushed to war shows that that the momentum had been gathering and that there was going to be what might be called a cleansing or a catharsis. But nobody in late July of 1914 could possibly have guessed how gigantic this thing was going to be. And so we think of World War II as the big war because it killed 6 to 10 times more people than World War I did. World War I killed about 8 to 10 million. World War II, possibly up to 100 million. But World War I was the greater shock to Western civilization because nobody could have anticipated that such a cataclysm and nightmare could possibly occur. And so that was the one that kind of shattered the idea of progress and enlightenment and the rule of law and diplomacy and mutual tolerance and coexistence. And so this one little event probably shouldn't have been able to touch off a world war, except that the European dynamics were such that that war was probably going to come. And then, as you say, it lasted really from 1914 until 1945. You could even say it lasted until 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Okay. So now let's get back into, as this whole thing is crumbling apart here. So on July 29th, Germany demand Russia stop its partial mobilization. As I showed you on the map, they're mobilizing against the Germans too. So on July 3rd, Tsar Nicholas of Russia orders full mobilization. So when the Germans say stop mobilizing, the Tsar says, that was a partial mobilization. We'll show them a mobilization. So they fully mobilize. So on July 31st, Germany declares war on Russia. Keeping in mind, Germany and Russia have nothing to do with this assassination down here and what's going on in Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They have nothing to do with it. Now we've got Germany declaring war on Russia. So Germany invades France. Any questions? Okay, Clay, we've cleared it up. Everybody got it. Everybody understands this. Why? Somebody says why. Okay. So Germany invades France through Belgium, and that's how World War I begins. So you've got a flashpoint down in Sarajevo, an assassination that should have been just, and this is a time when there were a lot of assassinations. There were the anarchists of this time, and the anarchists were assassinating kings and princes, and there were revolts within governments, and so it was a time of incredible turmoil. The assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand should have been just another one of those anarchist kind of assassinations. But because of the dynamics of Europe, as Clay was talking about, because of the dynamics of Europe, we ended up in a full world war. So why then is Germany invading France? I'm going to get to it. The next day then, Great Britain declares war on Germany. So Germany, after all this building up going on between Austria, Hungary, and Serbia, and the Russians getting involved, and the Germans declaring war against the Russians, then the Germans invading France through Belgium, then Great Britain says, hey, we'll be part of it too, and Great Britain then declares war on Germany. So why did this all happen? Well, now we need to get to our good friend Otto von Bismarck, after which this town is named and this college is named. Bismarck is important in this only because he was no longer around after 1890. It is Otto von Bismarck that works with the Prussian monarch and unifies all of Germany. Clay already mentioned that Germany was a new nation. And so Bismarck gets the credit for doing that. And he was the first chancellor of the German Empire from the unification in 1871 to 1890. He practiced what's called realpolitik. And realpolitik, from Bismarck's perspective, was that a country only does what's in a country's best interest only to gain a specific objective. You're realists about this. You're not moralists. There's a lot of things you're not, but you're realist about what your political ambitions are from a country's perspective. And Wilhelm II, or William II, fires him in 1890. And when he fires Bismarck, Bismarckian realpolitik falls by the wayside. And from that point on, we have a whole different dynamic. Now, to talk a little bit about Bismarck and realpolitik, from 1815, there was a Congress of Vienna, and Metternich, Prince Metternich was an Austrian, And he established what is called the Metternich system. And the Metternich system is that countries supported each other for the continuity of their particular monarchy. And it worked fabulously. And if there was something going on within one of the countries and they needed steeling up to make that monarchy stand up, then people would rush from other countries to support that monarchy. And that sort of laid the basis of realpolitik across all of Europe. And then, okay, first I'll do this, and then I'll defer to you again, Clay, here. This is what Germany looked like before it was united. These are all principalities, German principalities. So you see where it says West Prussia and East Prussia? Okay, those are the Prussians, but everybody else was something else. They were all Germanic people. They were all Germans, if you will, but Germany itself was not a country until Bismarck, working with the Prussian monarch, managed to start, and I'm not going to go through the whole list, but a number of minor wars that would gain some solidarity within Germany itself to help create a cement around these principalities and wickered those together. So that's what Germany looked like before 1871. This is a gathering of German princes, a painting of a gathering of German princes. Every one of those military uniforms that you see out there, another prince that ran a principality. And it wasn't until 1871 that the Prussian monarch, under, certainly, I shouldn't say under, but with Bismarckian genius, managed to put together all of Germany. So by 1871, you now have the German Empire. So instead of this in the center of Europe, you have this, a German Empire. That was put together, again, under Bismarckian genius, that was put together. And I would argue that from 1890 to 1914, the issue is, how do you integrate this new nation, Germany, within the balance of power of the rest of Europe? And it's not done very well. Okay, so before I go on to this, Clay, any thoughts about Bismarck and the unification of Germany?
Well, there are several new countries in this moment. So Germany is a new country, and it's been patched together by the political genius of Otto von Bismarck. But it was probably going to come together sometime soon anyway. Italy is a new country. Italy dates its nationhood to the 1870s, same time as Germany. Serbia is a new country that has detached itself from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so you have these new nations that they're demographically pretty pure. You have an Italian stock that creates Italy. You have a Teutonic stock that creates Germany, and you have a Slavic stock that, and the Serbia is just one of the Slavic entities in the Balkans that want to free themselves of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So nationalism plays a very large part in World War I. Take Italy, for example. Mussolini was a socialist, and when the war broke out, he denounced it as just the way that the Nonpartisan League would do in North Dakota. This was a munitions war by plutocrats, that this was really just the most powerful and wealthy people in the world going to war for no good reason, and that all socialists should oppose it. But he almost immediately changed his mind, Larry, and realized that this was an opportunity for the new nation of Italy to bind itself together through common patriotism and nationalism. And so he became an ardent supporter of the war because he thought it would be the glue that finally created once and for all the nation of Italy. So did Germany think that if they fought this war, that this would be a binding event for the new German nation. So nationalism is a very, very strong element in all of this. And if you hadn't had these just emerging new nations, this might not have happened. The country that was most reluctant to go to war in 1914 was Great Britain. And Britain had the most to lose. Britain was the most stable of all of these countries. Britain did not have any particular desire to go to war on the continent. They hadn't been to war on the continent for more than 100 years. They only came in because they felt they had no choice, thanks to their agreement with France to protect Belgium if it were attacked. But the stable countries wanted war less than the unstable new countries, and the new unstable countries wanted war not necessarily for any principle. They wanted it because they thought it would be a binding energy for their nationhood. And the great example of that is Mussolini.
Mm-hmm. So back to your point, what we have going on at this time simultaneously is the rise of new nations and the crumbling of old, as you've already pointed out.
Two are coming apart. Austria-Hungary is starting to come apart. It'll be gone after the war. There will be an Austria, but there won't be an Austria-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire goes at the end of the war. And so these were basically heirs to the old Roman Empire. So different entities were holding different parts of the European continent together. But you had so many different ethnic groups, so many different languages, so many different histories, that these were artificial constructs that couldn't be held together. And so with the rise of these nationalisms around Europe, there was a centrifugal force pulling Europe apart. And so when the war is over, the map of Europe is a completely different map. Unfortunately, this anticipates something I'm sure you're going to say later, Larry, but because they didn't really resolve the great questions of World War I, this made World War II inevitable, and we're still seeing it. I mean, under Bill Clinton, we saw the former Yugoslavia in civil war. These ethnic nationalities were held together by tyrannies. The minute those tyrannies disappear, there is a lot of dynamic shuffling in those nations before they finally settle on borders and find a way to live with each other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so everybody has a view of the landscape that we're dealing with as we're building up to the war. So now let's take a look at some of the issues that come to play. Each one of these countries has a particular problem. Germany's problem is encirclement. The Germans are concerned they're going to have to fight war on two fronts. They're going to have to fight, maybe, as this plays out, if a war starts, they're going to have to fight war with Great Britain and with France on their western frontier, and then they're going to have to fight very big Russian bear on the eastern front. So Bismarck was smart enough to figure out how to develop alliances and how to put clauses into treaties that allowed escape, if you will, loopholes into whether or not going to war was really in your national interests. And what we see after Bismarck is that these alliances that I'm going to talk about here in just a little bit are much more concrete. And I'll read you what Henry Kissinger has to say about that. But at any rate, so that's Germany's problem. They're concerned about encirclement. Russia's problem is twofold. They've got the Slavic ties down in the Balkans that we talked about earlier, but they also have the Dardanelles. And that's the pathway right through Turkey that is the outlet from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. And the Russians are very concerned about the Dardanelles falling into hands that are opposed to them. It's much like Clay can relate to this and talk about it. Thomas Jefferson, when he bought the Louisiana Purchase, that the Great Plains is all part of it, was really after only one thing, and that was New Orleans. He had to have New Orleans. And the Russians looked at the Dardanelles in the same way, that the Dardanelles, they had to be able to ship through the Dardanelles. And the Germans at this point had actually assigned a German commander to run the security of the Dardanelles. And so that's problematic for the Russians. Anything on that, Clay?
Well, only that, you showed Churchill, and Churchill becomes one of the great men of World War II. He had a really bad World War I. He, first of all, was a warmonger. He was one of the first British people to say, we should fight this war and we should fight it because there will be glory in it. So he was a little bit like Theodore Roosevelt in being a jingoist and a warmonger. But then when the war happened, he advocated a British attack on Gallipoli, in this very area of the Dardanelles, and he thought if they could knock Turkey out of the war and control the Black Sea, that the war would end much sooner. And so he was responsible for the Allied attack on Gallipoli that turned out to be one of the great disasters of World War I. It's amazing that Churchill emerged after his bad run in World War I and went on to survive politically. He was a backbencher for many years, and then to become the prime minister and maybe the most important player in World War II as it fell out. But you wouldn't have expected, if you had taught about his career in 1920, you would have said, this man is finished.
Yeah. So, but as we're building up to the war, the Russian problem now is the Dardanelles. That's one of their problems. They have many problems. This is an oversimplification, I assure you. France has a problem. France wants to figure out how to protect its Atlantic coast, and yet it's got that German frontier, but it also wants to have the Navy that can go into the Mediterranean. Now, one of the problems here is that the French have vast, vast colonial holdings. So if you take a look at this, if you take a look at French West Africa, the French, while being concerned about protecting their own Atlantic coast on their west, they've got to worry about all of that area in Africa that they have to have ships to protect that as well. So how the French solve their problem is they ask the Brits, then, I don't know if that's my next slide, back here. So the French are working with the British and say to the British, well, as long as you've got all the ships, because the British had the largest navy in the world, as long as you've got all those ships, will you protect our western coast? And the British agree to that, and then the French can be worrying about the Mediterranean and about all their holdings down in Africa. Okay. Now, the Brits' problem is that they're going to have to defend now west coast of France as well as all of Great Britain, and the German Navy is growing and becoming much more powerful. And the British are concerned about how do we check the German Navy. So all these countries have problems. So, huge oversimplification. I see Perry back here taking notes. I don't know if he's writing down or he's disagreeing with what we're saying here. Perry's taking notes because this is a huge oversimplification, and I'm sure Perry in a semester could elucidate on a lot of these issues. But, so the Allies' solution is the Entente Cordiale, which is an agreement between Russia, France, and Great Britain. So, that's the blue stars that we have. The Allies form the Entente Cordiale. The Central Power is going to solve their problem with the Triple Alliance, and that's Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy. Now, Italy ends up fighting with the Allies' side. That's a whole nother story about how the Italians ended up doing that, and Clay already alluded to some of that. But that's their solution. So now, you got the Central Powers have formed the Triple Alliance, and there's many other treaties involved in this whole thing. There was the Three Emperors Alliance, and there's all kinds of alliances, but we're just trying to understand how we had this rush into war. So Germany's problem, remember, is encirclement. So what they developed is a plan. The Germans, it's called the Schlieffen Plan, goes way back to 1905, that in order not to have a two-front war, and Russia would mobilize so slowly that if they attacked France first and defeated France in 6 weeks, then they could turn their attention back to the east and back to Russia. Okay? That was the Schlieffen Plan. So, when Germany invades France through Belgium, it makes perfectly good sense now, doesn't it? Right? Because you've got all these alliances. The Germans don't want to be encircled, and all these alliances come together. And what I want to do is I want to read one quotation from Henry Kissinger in his book, Diplomacy. And by the way, Henry Kissinger's doctorate was in Metternich, Prince Metternich of Austria. And so he understood how all this alliance system was set up in 1815 and was supposed to continue on, and then the whole thing falls apart later on. So Henry Kissinger, for you young people in the crowd, he was once Secretary of State. So just, the crisis over the Archduke's assassination ran out of control because no leader was prepared to back down, and every country was concerned above all with living up to formal treaty obligations rather than to an overall concept of long-range common interest. What Europe lacked was some all-encompassing value system to bind the powers together, such as had existed in the Metternich system, or the cold-blooded diplomatic flexibility of Bismarck's Politik. World War I started not because countries broke their treaties, but because they fulfilled them to the letter. So now, considering you've got these alliances, these protective alliances between the Entente Cordiale and the Central Powers, you can see that Germany's immediately, in fact, it's one of the things Kissinger calls this is the Doomsday Machine. The Doomsday Machine was the Schlieffen Plan. So as soon as there was a threat to Germany and Germany was going to be involved in a war, practically anywhere on continental Europe, Germany had to invade France because they had to knock France out first. Then they could turn their attention to the rest of the European conflict. Okay, before we jump into what actually happened, Clay, any additions to this?
Just that, the Schlieffen Plan made sense. The Germans were always afraid of a two-front war, and particularly afraid of one that involved Russia because of Russia's enormous landscape. They had learned from Napoleon's failure in Moscow, and because of the gigantic population base in Russia. And so the Schlieffen Plan made perfect sense, and it worked in World War II. In World War II, the Nazis were able to knock out France early, and that left only Britain and the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, Britain turned out to be much more difficult than Hitler thought. But the same plan was used in World War II, is that you don't want to fight a true front war unless you absolutely have to, and France is the easiest of the nations to knock out. It didn't happen in World War I because of the new technologies, the tank and the machine gun, technologies that the Germans couldn't have anticipated playing so significant a role in the war.
Okay. Cammie's not with you today, is she, Perry? Okay, because she would be insulted by what Clay just said about the French. Just want you to know. Okay.
They didn't hold up well the Second War, I'll just say that.
All right, so now here's what happened. The plan fails. And when Germany executes the Schlieffen Plan, it's not executed fully. It's not executed like it's supposed to be executed. The French were more resilient. They had reserves in places the Germans didn't anticipate, and for a lot of reasons, the Schlieffen Plan fails. So Germany now ends up in a two-front war. And World War I now is dominated, I think, literally and figuratively in trench warfare. Each side just entrenched, and they would fight for days at the cost of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives, with thousands and thousands of artillery, guns going off, and the machine guns and all that, and it just entrenched. And all of that would go on to win a few hundred yards. And then they would lose it again. Awful, awful war.
Larry, just about that, that I've been reading a lot of this literature because of Theodore Roosevelt in World War I, and we haven't yet talked about the United States at all, but when you read it, you realize the incredible shock that the war was. So these armies, the Germans are 300 yards or 400 yards in their trenches away from the French. And the line went all the way from the North Sea to Switzerland. And you could actually walk, if you really wanted to, through the trenches all the way from the North Sea to the Swiss border. And so the British officers would say, 10,000 of you, jump up out of the trenches and attack the German line. And so they would do it because they were, as you know, the cliche is you're always fighting the last war. They're fighting the war of the 19th century. So 10,000 Brits or French jump up and go towards the German line. They're all mowed down with machine guns. I mean, the carnage, 10,000 killed in a day, 32,000 killed in a day, 65,000 killed in a day. It's because you would send out these troops and you had these machine guns, hundreds of them, that could literally mow down line after line after line of soldiers. Nobody had ever seen anything like this in the history of warfare. It came as an unbelievable shock, and so both sides realized we're not going to be able to win this by throwing troops at this. This is going to require artillery. And so then the question was, can we bring heavy enough artillery to these trenches and lob it up over into them and shatter enough bodies or enough of these tunnels so that the other side will have to drop out. But as the war went on and on and on, 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917, hundreds of thousands, even millions are killed. Nobody's gaining more than a few yards or miles of territory at any given time, but nobody will give up because now they're too deep in. What they thought would, when the British went off to war in the summer of 1914, they sang "We'll Be Home by Christmas." The same songs were sung in Germany. People were joyful to go off to war. They thought it would be glorious. And they get out there and it turns out into just a death machine. Mm-hmm. And by the time you've lost 800,000 of your young men, you can't back down. Now you want to see it through grimly somehow so that something can be saved, so that there's some national redemption or meaning in this thing. And there was no overarching authority except Woodrow Wilson, who tried to say, look, this is insane. There has to be a better way to stop this thing than to just wait for somebody to be so exhausted that they can't go on. But that's precisely what happened.
Yeah. And it becomes, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, but it becomes the classic war of attrition. Germans had calculated how many French or Brits that each German soldier had to kill before he was killed, and how many they would have to kill before they got killed, because eventually the mathematics would show that they would eventually win the war, pure war of attrition. And let's take a look at that. So now, before we jump into that, this to me is just interesting. This is just of interest. So these are the monarchs that are at war when the First World War kicks off. You got King George V from Great Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm, the German Kaiser from Germany, and of course the Tsar from Russia, and Charles of Austria, and the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire. These are the monarchs at the start of this war. And Clay's already talked about the Austro-Hungarian Empire was falling apart, the Ottoman Empire was falling apart, but these are the monarchs that started in this war. These are the cousins that started this war. I find this just fascinating. So Kaiser Wilhelm, who's on your right, Kaiser Wilhelm, King George, and Tsar Nicholas's wife, up in the top corner, the Tsarina Alexandra, were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria of England, and they were all thus first cousins. Wilhelm, at one time after the war got started, said if grandmother was still alive, she wouldn't have let us go to war. What a great line. Also first cousins are George V and Tsar Nicholas. Those are the guys on the left. And do they look alike? It might just be the facial hair, I don't know, but they really look like brothers rather than cousins. But their mothers were sisters. And then King George, Kaiser Wilhelm, and Tsar Nicholas were all fifth cousins, as they were all descendant from King George II. So if you graph this thing, that shows you these are the cousins that went to war. So the blue line are first cousins. The green line between the two of them are first cousins, and then the red line are fifth cousins. So these are all relatives because they had to marry within the royalty themselves. So, if you were a royal, you had to marry somebody, and you saw the Danish family, for example, had royals, the Norwegians had royals, the Italians had royals. You had to marry within royal families, so it seems inevitable that you're going to have relationships here. Now, these are the ones deposed by the war. So you've got King George V is the only one left standing after the war. The Kaiser's gone, the Tsar's gone, the Ottoman Empire's gone, the Sultan's gone, and of course the Austro-Hungarian Empire is gone. Any thoughts? I just found this of particular interest, Clay. Any thoughts on it?
Well, one of the larger dynamics is the sweeping away of monarchies. You know, how many monarchies are there after the war? So that's part of what's happening, the rise of nationalism, and it really had begun with the American and the French revolutions, but the replacement of monarchies with other forms. And the war sweeps away empire, although World War II did more than World War I, and sweeps away these monarchies. But I was reading about this the other night here in Rome, and Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas were sending telegrams and letters to each other in the days before the war broke out. And Kaiser Wilhelm would say, "Dear Nicky." You know, he actually called Tsar Nicholas cousin Nicky. And Tsar Nicholas would write back and say, dear Willy. They were on such a familiar basis, and they were sort of tut-tutting, oh, we hope this doesn't come to war, it'd be a real shame for the family if this all happened. So you have this bizarre irony, or this mismatch between the connection between all of these monarchs personally, but the nations that each one was kind of trying to hold together, they couldn't do whatever they wanted. They had to follow the lead of the nations. Russia didn't want to be in this war. They were only in this war because they felt they had to support their fellow Slavs in Serbia. The British didn't want to be in this war. They only came in because they felt they had to honor their commitment to Russia and France, and then particularly what tripped Britain into the war was the rape of Belgium, when a neutral country was invaded by the Germans. So you have all of this, you have family connections coupled with national reluctance. There are so many factors here. There's one reason, I don't know about you, Larry, I didn't really study World War I when I was in school. I don't think many people do. One reason that it's hard to study is because it's so very complex. By comparison, World War II is almost a morality tale of good versus evil. But World War I there are no heroes in World War I. There's no single nation whose behavior was wholly honorable, except the United States comes pretty close with the idealism of Woodrow Wilson.
Right. And to Kissinger's point is that these countries rushed into war without ever evaluating their own national interests. And we ended up with World War I.
But if they had known that they were going to kill 10 million of their young people, if someone could have said to them, this is what's going to happen, I'm going to open the window and show you what Europe is going to look like in 5 years, they probably wouldn't have gone to war, because all of these countries thought it was going to be a short war, that there would soon be a resolution, that their nearest and immediate aims would get met. And nobody in Europe predicted that this was going to be the nightmare that it became, and if they had known this, they probably would have tried harder to stay out of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's sort of the tale of all wars. The American Civil War, no one would have guessed that 700,000 Americans were going to die in that war either. And oh, by the way, there was one thing I wanted to make a point, as long as we're having a conversation about this. You know, so often people say that World War I was the first modern war, and yet when you see,
Civil War.
The Civil War is clearly a modern war, and the Crimea War before that was clearly a modern war, and yet the generals. I'm not insulting any general that's sitting in the room right now, Murray. Thanks for being here, by the way.
Oh, Murray's there.
Murray's there. But the generals just never learned, it seemed, from each one of those wars. And Clay said that they fought the last war. Well, so many of these generals were fighting 3 or 4 wars back, the cavalry charges and all that sort of stuff, and yet the technology had really changed the nature of war. Okay, this graphic just sort of shows you what happened in this trench warfare. We're not going to spend a lot of time looking at the battles themselves, as I already said, but you've got these trenches, and they had communication trenches and reserve trenches and backup trenches, and they had tunnels underneath, and you know, the artillery you can see way in the background there, the long-range artillery, and they would start these things with barrages for hours, 4-hour barrages, 5-hour barrages of artillery. And what what they had learned on either side is, you can see they've got a deep dugout down there. What they found out is that as soon as the barrages start, you go to the deep dugout, you stay hidden down there, and then when the barrage stops, you run back to your machine gun nest and start machine gunning the guys coming across no man's land. Just incredible things that were going on in this environment. Terrible, terrible environment to live in. The good news here, if there's any good news on this at all, is that oftentimes those that were on the front lines up in the trenches were relieved every week or so. So soldiers would spend a week in the trenches themselves, and then they would come back for 10 days or whatever it was in sort of an R&R environment behind the lines, and then they would get, and so they had this constant rotation. So it wasn't as if somebody went into the trenches and spent 4 years in the trenches. They spent 4 years fighting a war, but part of that would be in the trenches, part of it would be back at some village in the background where they had their hospitals and all that sort of stuff. And because so little territory was actually conquered in any of these battles, as Clay and I have both said, you know, a few hundred yards or a few miles, with some noted exceptions, but terrible, terrible warfare. And this just shows you what it was like in the trenches. And again, this is just a graphic that shows you, and the over the top, as they talk about, over top is going up over the top of that revetment there and attacking. And so machine guns were set up on the other side. And by the way, for those of you that want to see what this looked like, there's 2 movies I would recommend. Gallipoli, which is about the real failed effort to attack the Ottoman Empire by the Brits. I would watch Gallipoli, and Paths to Glory, which Kirk Douglas is in. It's an old 1957's movie, but it has some extraordinary scenes of going over the top and actually fighting in this kind of environment. And of course, it became a mechanized war. The tank was developed specifically to get across no man's land and to go over the top of the trenches and to move troops. And the airplane was first used in any large environment, was first used in World War I, and of course the machine gun. I don't know how many of you saw the movie War Horse or seen the play War Horse, quite a few of you. My favorite scene in that is when the Brits first get to the war and they see some Germans out in the trees and they line up their horses in a cavalry charge and they ride across this open field, and as they do, the Germans uncover the machine guns and just start mowing down horses and men. And then after the battle, this German officer goes up to this British officer and says, "What were you thinking?" And it really, you got to wonder, and yet they did it time after time after time, over the top, run across no man's land into the machine guns. And it got so bad, as Clay mentioned, it was a long time, for 4 years. Towards the end of the war, right before the Americans become involved in the war, towards the end of the war, the French actually had mutinies in which soldiers refused to go over the top. And now there's all kinds of myths about this, about how that was actually handled. But in fact, there were some court-martials on these folks that refused to go over the top. And there were some executions. I was just reading recently about 50 confirmed executions of soldiers, French soldiers that refused to go over the top. But imagine yourself in this environment where you know that there's machine guns up on the other side, and some officer is walking along with a handgun and a whistle and blows the whistle, and you go over the top and you run across that no man's land. And extraordinary casualties in that time. So,
Larry?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just one thing about mechanized warfare, you know, Churchill was one of the advocates of the tank. That's one of the things that he distinguished himself with in World War I. He became one of its earliest champions when a lot of people thought it was a silly idea. The airplane didn't play a particularly large role in the war, and one of the things that is striking is how little each side knew about the movements of the other. You know, today we have satellites, so we know where all the troops are, and we have reconnaissance of every sort. radio was in its infancy, radar didn't yet exist, there were almost no aerial recon, and so there was a lot of bewilderment, especially in the first stages of the war, when nobody really knew what the other side was doing, and they couldn't see, as we now routinely can see almost everything. You know, we can send a drone with a small missile into a wedding party or a small tent somewhere in Yemen. You know, we know exactly what we're looking for today because of the sophistication of our reconnaissance equipment. That simply wasn't the case then. And then one other technology that I think is worth remembering is the submarine. The Germans were ahead of everybody with the submarine, and the submarine was a new form of warfare and a very destabilizing one, and you could almost say that it was the submarine that brought the Americans into the war, because Germany in 1917, to save itself, decided that it would engage in unrestricted submarine attacks on shipping to its enemies, and they took out enough American ships that public opinion forced Woodrow Wilson to declare war.
Yeah, and we're gonna get to that point here. But excellent points, yeah, and the airplane was used for reconnaissance, mainly during World War I. But, you know, one of the little historical known facts, we started using being in the air for reconnaissance. George Custer actually rode balloons during the Civil War because people thought it was so dangerous, and Custer was one guy that had no fear, apparently, and he would get in these balloons, and then he would check out what the other side was doing from these balloons, which I thought was kind of interesting. But at any rate, airplanes were used during World War I for reconnaissance, and some combat, not a lot. Anyway, just to show you some pictures of what it was like to be in the trenches. Terrible, terrible conditions. Really, they were developed by engineers to keep the sides up. In fact, there's stories of where entire groups of men were killed because the sides collapsed on them and killed all of them. But they had these trenches, and you know, going over the top is what that guy is doing there. Obviously, it's probably a posed picture, but nevertheless, he's trying to look over the top, and you would have an entire battalion of men lined up here waiting for someone, for the barrage to stop and for someone to blow the whistle and to go up over the top. This is actually a good action shot. It's from the movie Paths to Glory with Kirk Douglas. You can see the explosion going on, and look at the periscope that they had developed. There's actually a lot of innovations come out of World War I on how best to kill your fellow man. But they developed these sort of periscopes for viewing over the top, the tank, advances in machine guns, and the list goes on. Just a picture, you know, this looks more like no man's land than a trench. There's going over the top, coming out of the trenches and running across. And then the tank in action. It's another action photo. These guys are going over the top too. So going over the top meant that you had to get through the barbed wire, and your barbed wire and their barbed wire, and there's going to be artillery barrages going on and machine gunning going on all the time. I like to show this photograph. It's a German machine gun nest for a couple reasons. Number one, you can see how desolate that area had to get after all this firing and shooting and all that's going on. Secondly, the machine gun. They are using a machine gun. You can imagine what it would be like to be an individual up running across no man's land to try to take over that machine gun nest. The hand grenade that the German soldier has, looks like he's about to pull the pin and throw a hand grenade, called potato mashers, the way the Germans looked. The German hand grenades looked very different than the Allied grenades, but more so because of the gas mask. Because gas was a weapon that was used a lot in World War I. There were different kinds of gases, some gases affecting the lungs, mustard gas that would cause blisters on the skin, cause blindness, and so you had to prepare for gas. The reason eventually why folks stopped using gas is because once you've launched the gas, you have no control over it. So if the wind shifts, you launch gas, and now the wind shifts, and all of a sudden the gas is coming back to your own lines. So it's a real unpredictable weapon to be using, and a terrible weapon to be using. But there's the development of the gas mask during the war as well. And then I thought about this. Imagine the rainy season, what it had to be like. And I saw these pictures. I thought there's no reason to show these pictures, but awful, awful pictures of what happens to men wearing boots, standing in water like this, days and days and days and days at a time, and never being able to dry out. And it really is awful, awful what it does to the human body. So now, Clay, we're going to go to World War I U.S. involvement.
But before you do, Larry, could you just go back to the picture of the man with the explosion? It's where you're seeing the actual explosion.
Yes, by the periscope.
Yeah,
like Kirk Douglas.
I just find these photographs so, you chose beautifully. They're so sad. I mean, when you think about this war, there's a great book on this by Paul Fussell called The Great War in Modern Memory, and he talks about the memoirs and the letters home. And people talk about the number of lice that they would get. I mean, people were covered with lice. One of the first things that happened when they went back to the secondary and on their relief after a week or two was that they had to be deloused. There were rats that were eating human flesh. And so a person would die, and that night hundreds of rats would come into the trench and eat the body. And rats were crawling over their heads and over their bodies trying to get to corpses and other rats. There's a story of one memoir where a group of British people got a cat to kill the rats. And the next morning they found just the bones of the cat. The rats had attacked the cat and killed it and eaten it. We're talking about misery that is beyond anything that any one of us, I think, can imagine. There might be veterans in our audience that were in the Second War or Korea who suffered under similar circumstances, but the word shell shock first came into the English language during World War I, and it was precisely for photographs like the one that you're showing. And just before we move to the American piece of it, you know, Edward Grey was the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, and he was a friend of Theodore Roosevelt's, and he was a very deeply civilized man. He's one of the few who really understood what happened. And when the war was just breaking out in August of 1914, this is what he said. Probably people have heard this, but this is from his memoirs. A friend came to see me on one of the evenings of the last week. He thinks it was on Monday, August 3rd. We were standing at a window of my room in the Foreign Office. It was getting dusk, and the lamps were being lit in the space below on which we were looking. My friend recalls that I remarked on this with these words: "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." An amazing statement of foreshadowing of what was going to happen. The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. I mean, I think it's almost impossible for us living in our enormous comfort, where we are safer than any people who have ever lived on earth and more physically comfortable. We have showers, we're clean, we have soap, we have hygiene, we have the best medical systems that the world has ever seen. It's almost impossible for us to imagine the horror of this thing. These young Oxford and Cambridge students who marched off in glee to this heroic war and found themselves up to their waists in water and rats and lice and corpses. This was the war that shocked Western Europe out of its sense that progress was moving forward and that the Enlightenment and science were going to make things great. Almost nothing in the history of Western civilization was as stunning a blow to the confidence of civilized people as this war.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we ready to talk about America?
Yes, sir.
All right, so the slide I'm on right now, Clay, is the Woodrow Wilson quotation. So his declaration of neutrality. So when the war breaks out, Woodrow Wilson, who was a moralist, I mean, he believed that the United States could stay above this fray, that we ought to do what is morally right. And his quotation, what's really important is here, is the second sentence there. I think he's quoting Charles Dickens there in the first sentence, but at any rate, we must be impartial in thought as well as action. Now think about that. He is asking the American people that you have to be neutral in your thoughts as well as your actions. So here's the problem. 32 million of 92 million Americans were first or second generation Americans with strong ties to Europe. Now just think how many Germans there were right here in North Dakota at the outbreak of the war. And the President of the United States is saying, I want you to be neutral in thought and action. Well, that would be tough considering 32 million out of 92 million Americans. The second point is actions. So the American bankers, by the time the United States enters the war, American bankers had lent $2 billion to the Allies and $27 million to Germany. Now, which side do you think the bankers wanted to win? It's pretty obvious, right? Now, there's a North Dakota connection here that I'm intrigued by. Senator Gerald Nye in here. The embargo acts during Jefferson's time, the embargo acts dependent upon victory by the Allies. They were selling munitions to the Allies, they were loaning money to the Allies, and so even though the president had declared neutrality, the reality is that the United States was supporting the Allies. So as a result of neutrality acts, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's hands are virtually tied in 1939 because when war breaks out, there's not a lot he can do because the law prohibits it. And it almost goes back, it almost goes full circle, and Clay, jump in here. The embargo acts during Jefferson's time, the embargo acts was to prevent the United States from being financially attached to other nations that were involved in any kind of war. So the United States was just going to stay out of the war by stopping our ships from even trading out in the high seas. In Jefferson's time, it became incredibly political because it was an economic hardship for particularly the New England states at that time. But at any rate, fast forward to World War I and to all that's going on with the banking and the munitions industry, and then fast forward to the 1930s with North Dakota's own Gerald Nye investigating the munitions industry and investigating banking. So Clay, do you have some thoughts about that?
Well, just going back to Woodrow Wilson's neutrality proclamation, this occurred immediately after the war started. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is Wilson and Roosevelt. So Roosevelt had been president from 1901 to 1909. He would have given anything to have been president when World War I broke out, because that would have been a kind of test for his greatness of character and his manliness, and he felt that Wilson mishandled every piece of it, beginning with this. Nothing could have made Roosevelt more angry than having Wilson say you have to be neutral in thought as well as in action. Roosevelt thought that was something that only a nitwit could say. Only someone who'd never thought about human nature could say, and that it branded Wilson as a pathetic idealist in his mind who didn't understand anything of the way the world really worked. And so from that moment on, Roosevelt begins to criticize the sitting president in the public papers, and Roosevelt became more and more opinionated and angry and critical and unfair, and he savaged Wilson. He believed that Wilson should have responded more sternly to the beginning of the war, and particularly after the German attack on Belgium. He believed that Wilson should have moved towards American preparedness immediately, because it was inevitable in Roosevelt's mind that whether we liked it or not, we were at some point going to be drawn into this war, and so we had better prepare. Roosevelt believed that if we had prepared, if we had done a strong military preparedness campaign beginning in 1914 or 1915, that the Germans wouldn't have dared to sink the Lusitania or other ships that had American soldiers on them or American passengers on them, and that by not preparing, we enabled Germany to do atrocities that they wouldn't have dared to do otherwise. And then when the war was finally declared in 1917, Roosevelt said, A, I told you so, that we were going to be drawn into this war. B, we're not prepared. Now it's going to be 18 months before we're really ready to go to war. And Roosevelt calculated that maybe 1 million Europeans died because of Wilson's pussyfooting around about this. Anyway, he could not have been more unfair. I mean, imagine a former president and a famous president who won a glorious battle at San Juan Hill being so awful to the sitting idealist. Then when the war finally happened for the United States, Roosevelt went to see Wilson and said, all those things that I've been writing, let's just call that dust in a windy street. Let's let bygones be bygones. No harm, no foul. Now I want you to send me with a volunteer cavalry regiment over to France. And he couldn't believe that Wilson said no. I mean, the fact that Wilson even took the meeting was astonishing after the way Roosevelt had been so awful to Wilson in public. There's almost nothing in American history quite like it. And this, I always say when I talk about this, that World War I brought out some of the best and all of the worst in Theodore Roosevelt's character. And I can't imagine what it must have been like to be poor Woodrow Wilson with this jerk, but an exceedingly powerful, popular, well-informed jerk. Nagging him every step of the way.
Okay, thank you, Clay. And by the way, Clay, I don't know if you're watching a clock. We've got 30 minutes to get through all the rest of this, so.
Well, then you better hurry up.
Okay, so, back to Clay's point and Woodrow Wilson's point. I want you to be neutral in thought as well as action. Okay, this is difficult because of the American ties. It's difficult because of the financial ties that America is developing. And then also the English propaganda was very good at depicting the inhumane Huns raping Belgium. And unbelievable stories came out about throwing babies in the air and bayoneting them and doing all this sort of stuff. I mean, really atrocious stories that the English ensured that the Americans heard all about. And then there's the problem of contraband. The British Order of Council had set contraband. They had an expanding list of goods as the war dragged on that could not be imported by sea to mainland Europe. Well, as Clay's already pointed out, Germany's only defense against the British blockade was submarine warfare. That was the only defense they had, because the British controlled the high sea. The surface, they controlled it. So the British had the submarine, and they were going to try to defeat the British on the sea with submarines. Now, this presents a problem. So that area around Great Britain is the German submarine warfare zone. So they're going to try any ship going to Great Britain or to France, they're going to sink. Now, on and off, they sink some. Woodrow Wilson would sit at his desk, would type out his letter of protest. It would be filed with the Germans, and the Germans say, okay, we won't do it again. And then there'd be another one. And then Woodrow Wilson would sit down and type out another letter. And this happened throughout the full 4 years. Okay.
Larry?
Now, yeah, go ahead.
Just about that, you know, so the Lusitania is sunk in 1915, and that was one of the big atrocities because there were almost 2,000 passengers. It was a luxury liner. It was not a warship, although it turns out it was carrying some contraband. But there were almost 2,000 passengers on it, I think almost 200 of them Americans. So the Lusitania goes down off the coast of Great Britain, and Wilson sends this letter of protest. And Roosevelt is just fuming over this because he said, well, so they sink a ship and you send a letter of protest. The Germans responded negatively, so then the United States, Wilson sent a second letter of protest. At that point, Roosevelt said, okay, so someone slaps your wife, you send them a letter of protest? Then they slap her again. You send a stiffer letter of protest? I mean, when are you going to be a man? And he called Wilson all sorts of names, that he was a nervous Nellie and that he was a nervous Nancy, and he essentially called into question Wilson's basic manliness. But he also, outside of the noise, Roosevelt believed that by only sending a letter of protest over something as awful as the sinking of the Lusitania, that we were essentially giving Germany carte blanche to do more of this, that if we had responded more firmly sooner, either we would have been in the war and get it over with, or the Germans would have desisted, at least with respect to Americans. Either way, we would have been better off, according to TR.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit about the submarine warfare and move into that conversation and about the Lusitania, because submarine warfare changes the nature of war on the high seas. You know, war on the high seas was kind of a romantic thing, and a ship, they would broadside each other and they'd have this big battle. But the survivors, those who survived, then were brought onto the ship. They weren't just left out there for the sharks and to drown. And so after they've had a big sea battle, everybody that survived it is brought onto a ship. That was sort of the protocol of fighting on the high seas. Well, submarines weren't big ships. They're very small. If you've ever been in one, they're very cramped. And particularly the World War I submarines are very, very small and very, very cramped. And once you sink a ship, you've sunk the ship, and if there's any survivors, they're going to drown, they're going to be eaten by sharks, whatever the case might be. So it changes the very nature. It's seen as humane, and as Clay already mentioned, in 1915, the Lusitania is sunk. 1,100, almost 1,200 persons are lost, 128 are Americans. So as Clay already talked about, he remains stalwart. There's a continuing clamor for preparedness. However, in 1916, Woodrow Wilson runs for re-election, and what's his motto? He has kept us out of war. So in 1916, for 2 years, which included the sinking of the Lusitania, Woodrow Wilson has kept us out of war, and he wins re-election.
Including in North Dakota. Wilson won the election in North Dakota, a Democrat, one of the few occasions in North Dakota history when a presidential Democratic candidate won election in the state of North Dakota. He narrowly defeated the Hughes, the Republican opponent, in the 1916 presidential election.
Okay. So now let's take a look at how we ended up in the war, and I'm watching the clock here, Clay. So Germany, on February 1st, 1917, announces unrestricted submarine warfare. The war has been going on since 1914. The Germans can't figure out any way. I mean, the protest letters and all that's going back and forth. And the Germans finally say, hey, look, if you send a ship in this area, we're going to sink it. Well, then, coming on about the same time towards the end of February is what's called the Zimmermann telegram. British intelligence had gotten a telegram, had intercepted a telegram that was sent over the transatlantic wires from the foreign minister of Germany, Zimmermann, to his ambassador in Mexico City. And the Zimmermann telegram becomes really important in the United States' involvement in World War I. Because what is proposed by this telegram is that if Mexico will join the war on the side of Germany against the United States, when the war is over, Mexico can get back Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. That's the offer from the German foreign minister. This does not set well in the United States. Keep it in mind that Pershing, just a few years earlier, had actually invaded Mexico for a while. We'd had problems with Mexico. There had been tensions with Mexico. So now the Germans, and of course the Germans, it's very clear what they want to do. They want to have a war on the southern boundary of the United States to keep the United States from getting involved in the war in Europe, because they don't need Americans fighting in the war in Europe. So they offer to the Mexicans, you join us, and as one of the conditions of war, you will get back Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. But there was more. The second part of the Zimmermann telegram, it's the American Southwest, of course, but is the Yellow Peril. There's growing concern by Americans about the Japanese. The Japanese have become an imperial power. The Japanese in the the Japanese-Russian War of 19, somebody help me out here.
4 and 5, 6. 4, 5, and 6.
Okay. And Teddy Roosevelt ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his conduct during that war. But for the very first time ever, a nation of people of color has defeated a European nation. So the Russians are defeated by the Japanese in this war. And now the Americans are looking at Mexico, and they're seeing what they think, or certainly the British intelligence is letting us think, is a growing Japanese influence. So it's not just that the Mexicans are going to take back Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. It's the growing threat from Japan that's going on at the very same time. So these two things combined, then by April, so this all happens in February, by April now, and in March, there are a number of American ships that are sunk. So by April, which was Good Friday, Woodrow Wilson asked for a declaration of war. Clay.
Yes.
No, I don't know what you're reading there, but...
I'm looking at my notes about North Dakota's response.
Oh, okay. So let's go into that. I'm going to turn this. We only have about 20 minutes left, Clay. So there's three major things you wanted to talk about here. So have at it.
Well, first of all, we want to make sure we get a couple of questions in. Let me be very brief. First of all, North Dakota's response to the war was fascinating. And if you want to read about it, the best thing to read is Elwin Robinson's History of North Dakota. And he has a marvelous chapter on North Dakota's response to World War I. 1 out of 5 North Dakotans was a German. We also were isolationist. These were immigrants from Norway, from Germany, from Finland, from Sweden, from Czechoslovakia, who had come here to get away from the madness of Europe, and the last thing they wanted to do was now be drawn into some struggle that nobody could explain why it was even happening. And so North Dakota was amongst the most isolationist places in North America when the war broke out, and the North Dakota newspapers, the Fargo Forum, the Bismarck Tribune, and others were quite neutral, and they were not as outraged by the rape of Belgium as other papers in the United States, and they were constantly urging the United States to be cautious and not to be drawn into this thing unnecessarily. Then Henry Ford sent his peace ship over to Europe to try to forestall the war. It was the Oscar II, and one American governor and one major political figure and one only was on that peace ship, and it was North Dakota Governor Lewis B. Hanna. So our got on a ship and went over to the old world to try to talk sense to the Europeans and to keep them from doing this incredibly self-destructive thing. Senator Grana in the United States Senate was one of 6 votes against the war when the war declaration finally came in April of 1917, and he was the first nay vote. So he wasn't just one of the 6 who voted no. He was the first one to have the moral courage to stand up on the United States Senate's floor and say, I cannot in good conscience vote in favor of this war. North Dakota's response to the war is just completely fascinating. And the Nonpartisan League had come to power in 1917, and the Nonpartisan League, I'll come back to in a minute, but it was very sternly against American involvement in the war, and people like A.C. Townley were giving speeches not only in North Dakota but all over the United States saying, this is not our war, we're minding our own business, we raise wheat, this is really the munitions industry and the international Jewish conspiracy and plutocrats and businessmen, and they're sending our young boys off of farms to fight the war, but they're not fighting the war. They're sending us to do this on their behalf. And Townley and the Nonpartisan League said we need to conscript wealth. Everyone should pay the sacrifice that they can afford to pay. So if I'm going to send my children off to fight in the war, then wealthy Americans need to have their wealth conscripted because that's what they can provide to help the war. We shouldn't be selling war bonds. We should be taxing the wealthiest Americans who are profiting from this war and making sure that they are sacrificing too. This cost him a lot of trouble. But one thing I want to do before we run out of time, Larry, is to talk about American Indians in the war. Indians always are more likely to enter America's wars than you would ever expect given our treatment of them, and they always oversubscribed for their population base, and they fought valiantly in World War I. And when the war ended, there was the first victory dance on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation since the Little Bighorn. Think of that. The last victory dance that the Standing Rock Lakota had was after the Little Bighorn. Things had been so awful after that. Now in 1918, after Armistice Day, they held a victory dance for the first time in all that time. And then, this is my favorite piece of it all, this is also in Robinson. When they learned of the fate of the Kaiser, that he had lost and he was now having to abdicate, the Standing Rock Lakota said that what they would urge him to do was to get an allotment of land somewhere in America and to get a log cabin and a team of horses, a harness, a wagon, a few cattle, and some agricultural implements, and be told to prosper on it. And then to say to Kaiser Wilhelm, I'm quoting now, "Now you lazy bad man, you farm now and make your living by farming, rain or no rain. And if you do not make your own living, don't come to the agency whining when you have no food in your stomach and no money, but stay here on your farm and grow fat till you starve." So they're using this occasion in satire to say, if we treated the defeated Kaiser Wilhelm the way you all have treated us, that would be a true punishment for losing World War I. It's an amazing story. North Dakota has a lot to be fascinated about in our own response, not only to World War I, but to World War II, where Gerald P. Nye was one of the handful of senators in that war to vote no on the floor of the United States Senate.
Okay. Fascinating. Okay, you want to talk about Kate Richards O'Hare?
Just briefly, Kate Richards O'Hare was a Kansas socialist and an agitator, and she had been the first woman to run for the United States Senate in 1916 in Kansas. She had not made it. She had been candidate for U.S. Congress in Kansas in 1910 and failed. But when the war broke out, she was on a socialist committee on war and militarism, and she went around the United States and she gave essentially the same lecture everywhere, and it was about America and the war. And she came to Bowman, North Dakota on July 17th, 1917, and she gave a lecture about the war, and in it, Germany had just been saying as German national policy that German women had a duty to get pregnant, in marriage or outside of marriage, to bear more young men to carry on the German war if it lasted that long, and that the Germans were pushing strenuously for German women to have babies. And so she in Bowman, North Dakota on July 17, 1917 said, "I hope the United States doesn't follow this ridiculous command, and if we did, it would be like making women brood sows." That's the sentence that got her indicted. The speech was reported. Our Senator Porter McCumber denounced her on the floor of the United States Senate. She was arrested in Devil's Lake on July 29th, 1917, and she was tried in Bismarck, our own Bismarck, on December 5th, 1917. A judge was imported from Iowa, Judge J.M. Wade. It was a 4-day trial, and she was convicted. And she went to prison for 5 years in Missouri for having said in Bowman, North Dakota, that American women, if they were forced to or encouraged to be pregnant, would be nothing but brood sows. She defended herself wonderfully in this trial. We have the transcript. It's in the special collections up at the University of North Dakota. It's a fascinating story. So she went to prison in Missouri. She then got to know Emma Goldman and other famous national agitators, and she then pushed for prison reform in Missouri. She was released, pardoned early because there was a national uproar over this. She moved to California, where she spent the rest of her life working for prison reform in California and the United States. So one of the great reform figures of American history just happened to bumble into Bowman on one of her national tours, and it was there when she gave an identical speech to one she had given in 75 other places that she was arrested because, of course, North Dakota was in the middle of this gigantic controversy over the Nonpartisan League, and so things were more volatile here than they were anywhere else at that key moment.
Okay, and A.C. Townley?
Townley did the same thing. So he gave speeches in Minnesota. Minnesota was much more repressive than North Dakota during the war, and there were patriot councils, and the nonpartisan league was banned from many cities. All they had said was, you should go to war if you want to, but you should know that the war is being supported by plutocrats and munition interests. And Townley once said, why should we have our lean farmers fighting the war when those fat plutocrats would stop more bullets over in Europe? And so Townley was a sarcast and an ironist, but he gave a speech in Minnesota, and he was indicted under the Espionage Act, one of the most repressive laws in the history of the Bill of Rights. And he then was convicted, and he went to prison in Jackson, Minnesota, in southwestern Minnesota, for about 2 months. And he was treated as a kind of celebrity there. But the conclusion of all of this is that the Nonpartisan League came to power in 1917 and changed the face of North Dakota. It probably would have faded away over time no matter what. But World War I shattered the Nonpartisan League, and they never recovered from the charge of being disloyal and impeding recruitment and being critical of America's patriotic war effort. Some of this was very unfair, but they were charged with this, and Townley went to prison, and the NPL never really recovered from that international crisis. It would have been very interesting to see what would have happened to the Nonpartisan League or to the socialist movement at large in the United States if World War I hadn't come along to shatter that interesting period of dissent.
All right, thank you, Clay. We're not going to spend a lot of time. We're really running out of time here, so I'm going to kind of whip through these. The 14 points, Woodrow Wilson always took a moralistic view of the war, and he established the 14 points. And if you were to read all of them, I'll just quickly, freedom of the high seas for obvious reasons, right? Reduction of armaments, things we've already been talking about, the evacuation of territories, independence. And at the very bottom, the 14th point was the creation of a League of Nations. Well, the United States will never ratify the treaty that comes out of the war because of the League of Nations. The United States wanted nothing to do with it, and so his Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, FDR, takes that same idea, and at the end of World War II, they create the United Nations. So the first attempt to do that was the League of Nations, and it becomes the United Nations after World War II. Very quickly, Germany's secret weapon was Lenin. There was a revolt in Russia because of World War I going on, and a provisional government was established. And then the Germans actually secret Lenin into Russia with, they say, trunkloads of money to ensure that there could be a communist revolution. There was, and then the Russians and the Germans signed a separate treaty, so the Germans don't have that two-front war that's been going on for so long. And then as a result of that, the Romanov family is executed. This is Tsar Nicholas with his family, and they are executed then in July of 1918. So the Americans enter the war in the summer of 1918, and by November 11th, then the armistice is signed in 1918. The Americans are in the war for a very short period of time, a very short period of time. War is declared in 1917, but it's not until really December of 1917 the first Americans get to France. And then by the spring and summer of 1918 is when the Americans actually have influence in the war itself and start winning some battles. And the Germans realize this is the end for them as well, because now a major industrial power has joined the Allies' side. And just for your interest, I don't know how many of you have ever been to the All Veterans Memorial right on our Capitol grounds, but if you're there on the 11th of November at 11 o'clock, the sun comes through a little hole in the top of that thing, and it lands right on North Dakota on the globe. How many of you have seen that? Great, I'm glad. If you've not seen it, you need to do it. It's an amazing thing that's on our own Capitol grounds. I don't know how they figure out to do that. I know the Mayans could have figured out how to do that, but I don't know how to do it. And it's really an amazing thing to see. At any rate, the casualties are huge. As I said, the Americans paid very little. I mean, for the 118,000 that died, that's 118,000 families that were affected. But when you take a look at the difference between the Germans and the Russians and the French and the British, the Americans paid a very low price. So at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, these are the big four. Great Britain, Italy, France, and the United States. Excluded are the Soviets and the Germans. And the Paris, the Treaty of Versailles that comes out of that, number one has the war guilt clause. This war was all Germany's fault. The Germans will lose 13% of their territory. They'll lose all their overseas colonies. There are military restrictions imposed on the Germans. There are war reparation payments imposed on the Germans. The Germans lose coal to the French, ships to the Great Britain, and patents to the United States. The Bayer Aspirin Company was a German company. And as a result of this treaty in 1919, the Bayer subsidiary in the United States becomes an American company. So the Americans actually got the patent, and it stayed that way until 1994, when the Bayer company in Germany then rebought their own patents from the American company for $1 billion. And then created the League of Nations, and of course the United States never ratified it. So this is what pre-World War I looked like. And this is what post-Versailles Europe looked like. Germany is still there, although there's Allied occupied zone. Austria and Hungary are two separate countries. There's a newly created nation of Yugoslavia, Poland, and notice that there's a split between Germany up there. The Polish are given a corridor to the sea. That becomes a bone of contention then in the build-up to World War II as well. So that was pretty quick. We've got 7 minutes left. I'm shooting for that 5 o'clock thing. Lori, hold up your microphone if you will. Lori has a microphone. If anybody has a question for Clay, Clay is more than willing to answer your questions. And if there's any conversation here, we've got a World War I. Bring the microphone over here, right down here. I'm going to put you on the spot. This is for our TV audience as well as our audience right here. Would you tell us what you, tell everybody who you are and tell them what you brought today?
I'm Marilyn Cunningham, and I brought my dad's World War I diary.
It's an amazing thing. She let me read it beforehand. And what I found interesting is that he was talking about the burials was from flu. In 1918, the soldiers were dying of flu.
Yes.
It's a fascinating thing. And when did you find out that your father had kept this diary?
Well, not until my mother passed away about 10 years ago. Went through her things, and what was so odd, or not really odd, that I kind of cried. In here, he says, "I wonder how my Gracie is doing," and that was my mother.
Oh, that's so sweet. That's great. Thank you for bringing that today. Okay, any questions? Peter's got one.
Do you think that if the peace had been brokered in a different manner, we might not have had World War II?
Yeah, obviously that's an ahistorical question. We don't know. We can speculate here about that. I think that the terms of Versailles are so harsh that they set up the rise of Adolf Hitler. Now, would we still had Germany involved in a Second World War? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that the conditions were set by the Treaty of Versailles for the rise of Adolf Hitler. Clay, what is your thought?
Impossible to know, but I wouldn't say that it was just Versailles. I think the war ended in exhaustion. There were no clear winners, no clear losers. In World War II, there was a clear winner. Britain and the United States and the Soviet Union clearly defeated Germany and its allies, and the United States defeated Japan, and nobody could doubt that. But World War I ended with uncertainty and irresolution, and so the very dynamics that led to the war had not worked themselves out, and now they appear to have worked themselves out. Germany is no longer a military threat. The jury is still out on this, I think, but Germany is now the economic superpower of Europe. It's accomplished economically much of what it was trying to accomplish militarily. The coming together of the German people in the 1870s destabilized all of Europe, and it's not clear where this ends. Germany is the one truly thriving economic power of Europe. They've renounced militarism, but that all the problems of the juggernaut that is Germany once those Teutonic peoples got into a unified system. So I think now with NATO and with the European community, the euro as the common currency, there is a kind of there's a stability in Europe that has never been seen here before. But I wouldn't, as a historian, you know, Larry, all bets are off. We don't know where this is headed.
I will say about the difference between World War I and World War II that we have to remember is World War I ended with an armistice with no foreign soldiers on German soil. So when the Germans signed the armistice that ended the war, they believed that Wilson's 14 points would be the blueprint for the Treaty of Versailles. Instead, they got very harsh treatment. So the stab in the back that Adolf Hitler talked about. So now World War II, go to World War II, it ended with unconditional surrender. And American, Soviet soldiers, British soldiers in Germany, in Berlin. Big difference in the way those two wars ended. Another question?
We still have bases all over Europe. The United States, in some sense, could be said to continue to occupy the European soil.
Any more questions? Any arguments? Okay, we do have another one, okay.
Everything that I read about the war is that a lot of people objected to the war, especially the unions. And I have an uncle that we lost. He disappeared. And he didn't want to go to the war, we think. And we think he was, people around him thought we shouldn't be in the war. And I thought there was a big buildup to get Americans to go to war.
Well, you know, a big buildup to get him to go to war. There was certainly a lot going on at TR, and I'll defer to Clay on answering that. But I think that both the wars, World War I and World War II, we see a lot of split opinions in the United States on whether or not this is our war. Even World War II, you know, Charles Lindbergh was a big leader of an American First initiative to say, we're not going to get involved in this German war. We did it in World War I, we're not, or the Great War, as they called it. We did it then, and we're not going to do it again. And so I think there's always split in the United States on whether or not to go to war. I don't know, Clay?
Well, Roosevelt's view was that you can look at this morally or you can look at this realistically. If you look at it morally, of course it's not our war. This is the insanity of Europe in what amounts to a gigantic civil war. But if you look at it practically, a nation as important as ours, with shipping all over the world, with economic ties to all of these countries, is not going to be able to stay out of a major European conflict. We're either going to be involved because our interests are at stake, or we're going to be involved because we need to stabilize the world as its supervisor, but we can't stand by and let the world self-destruct, because ultimately that will draw us down with it. And Roosevelt has actually proved, along with Henry Kissinger and others, to be right about this, that, you know, the moral approach is one that we admire, and I do deeply admire North Dakota's reluctance in World War I, but from a kind of a global perspective, the United States has been too important a power to avoid being drawn in one way or the other.
Okay, one last question here.
Japan's role in World War I, and also I've always wondered the tripartite in World War II, why did they not go into the Soviet Union, kind of ease the pressure off of the Germans there as well? I don't know if that's kind of a complex one, but first, what is Japan's role in World War I? And then in World War II, why didn't they attack the Soviet Union?
Holy cow. Perry? Just hang on for the mic so that everybody can hear you. It's a very, you know, there's very few Japanese are actually killed in World War I.
Yeah, the Japanese were actually our allies in World War I. And so that was a kind of an interesting transition. It's just like the Italians kind of would switch sides later too. And I'm not sure the second half of the question was. The Allied relationship with Japan in World War II is more simply common enemies. There was no real sense of, they never in any way coordinated anything militarily, diplomatically, or anything. It was simply a common source of enemies, and it was us. In fact, they signed a tripartite pact in 1941, which basically said the only power currently not at war with, which is America, if that country attacks us, all of us will go to war with America. So it was basically an alliance movement. The tripartite pact was an alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan that said, basically, if America goes into war, we'll all go to war against America. Technically, when Japan attacked us in Pearl Harbor, it didn't even kick in the tripartite pact, but Germany decided to do it anyway.
I knew Perry would have the answer. Thank you, Perry. Okay, it is after 5 o'clock. The sun has set while we've been sitting here. So thank you, everybody. And you know what, Clay Jenkinson, thank you so much for staying up till midnight in Rome and doing this. And it worked out, I think it worked out beautifully. What about the rest of you?
Larry, just one last word on this. We were reluctant to enter the war, but 31,269 North Dakotans served in World War I, and 1,305 died in World War I. 133 North Dakotans were decorated for heroic action in the war, and with the war bonds, there were 5 series of them. North Dakotans oversubscribed every one of them. In fact, we had the highest oversubscription rate in those war bonds of any state in the United States. So although we were very, very reluctant to get involved when the war came, the American Indian community stepped up in a big way, and North Dakotans served honorably in the war and were amongst the first National Guard units to enter France when we finally got troops there. So it's a story that we have not told adequately, but it is a fascinating one. Tomorrow I'll be hitting the streets in Rome again, Larry, and I shall send you a postcard.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you, Clay.
In fact, we had the highest oversubscription rate in those war bonds of any state in the United States. So although we were very, very reluctant to get involved when the war came, the American Indian community stepped up in a big way, and North Dakotans served honorably in the war and were amongst the first National Guard units to enter France when we finally got troops there. So it's a story that we have not told adequately, but it is a fascinating one. Tomorrow I'll be hitting the streets in Rome again, Larry, and I shall send you a postcard.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you, Clay.